everybody talked about, the fact that there could be election interference due to deep fakes. And at the beginning of an election year, on January, you had a deep fake. And, you had a deep fake of not anyone, you had a deep fake of the president of the free world. It couldn't get more high profile than that.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome to AI and the Future of Work, episode 302. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. If you enjoy what we do, please tell a friend and give us a like and a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you leave a comment, we just may share it in an upcoming episode. Like this one from Beth in Fort Wayne, Indiana, who says her favorite episode is the one with Navrina Singh. Oh, that is one of my favorites as well. The amazing CEO of Credo AI about AI ethics and responsible AI. Beth says she listens each week during her breaks as a librarian. She adds that she'd like an episode about whether or not AI will replace librarians. Beth, thanks for listening. AI may replace the card catalog, but it will never instill a love of reading in humans. And as I say frequently, loving learning is a skill we will never outsource to the bots. If you haven't heard it, go listen to that amazing episode with Navrina Singh. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show, and of course, the added bonus, you get one AI fun fact. Today's fun fact. Louis Columbus writes this week in VentureBeat that deepfake attacks will cause $40 billion in damage by 2027 as the technology becomes easier to deploy and harder to detect. Now, one of the fastest growing forms of adversarial AI, deepfake-related losses are expected to increase from $12.3 billion last year to $40 billion by 2027, growing at a 32% compound annual growth rate, or CAGR. It's projected that deepfake incidents will go up by 50 to 60% in 2024, with 140 to 150,000 cases globally predicted this year alone. Tools to create deepfakes are readily available online for as little as $20. This is a theme that we will pick up in this week's important conversation. Of course, as always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to today's conversation. Vijay Balasubramaniyan is the co-founder and CEO of Pindrop. He's held various engineering and research roles with Google, Siemens, IBM Research, and Intel. Vijay invented phone printing technology in 2010, launched Pindrop in 2011, and has since raised more than $200 million from an incredible list of investors, including friend of the podcast, JC2 Ventures, the venture fund founded by Cisco CEO and tech legend John Chambers. Vijay holds patents in VoIP security and scalability and frequently speaks on phone fraud threats at technical conferences like RSA, Black Hat, and CCS. Vijay holds a PhD in computer science from Georgia Tech. Thanks to Yvette from JC2 Ventures for great prep for today's conversation. And without further ado, Vijay, it's my pleasure to welcome you to AI and the Future of Work. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about that illustrious background and how you got into the space.
Dan, thank you for having me. So it's super interesting. I got into this space. I've been working in voice for a really long time. So back, I'm going to date myself. Back in Siemens, I used to work on the old landline system. So these were EWSD switches that used to be all over the world. And so it was what landline telephony was based out of. And I used to work there on old landline technology. At Google, I worked on Google Video Chat and Google Hangouts and, worked on the newer age voice systems. And at my PhD at Georgia Tech, I came to do my PhD in security. So given my background in voice and given, my inclination in security, I started working on voice security. And so that's how I got into voice security. And, I got into what we do at Pindrop by actually buying a suit in India and not getting it delivered. So that's the backstory of, how we came here.
So is Vijay first a researcher, an engineer, an entrepreneur. It's such a different role that you've now been in for more than a decade as a CEO, but obviously you got your start as a technologist.
I did. And, my team knows this. Research still gives me a lot of energy. When I get the time, I actually, ask my team for the latest and greatest in research papers. I'll print them out and, it'll be bedroom reading for me. So I still love research, but, over time I've played, and all CEOs do this, they have to wear many hats. You have to be the person writing the first financial spreadsheets. You have to build out the first marketing collateral. So you have to do everything. And so I've gotten to wear many hats.
Getting ready for this episode, I opened up the Wayback Machine on YouTube and I saw a talk that you gave at a Atlanta Venture Summit in 2011, talking about essentially the advent of this new threat vector, voice hacking. Was not something that was commonplace then, or even I think understood. And I was comparing that to the language that you use today to describe deepfakes and the increasing nature of the threat. What was it like in 2011 when you were trying to educate the world about this threat that was very misunderstood then?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Back then, it was really hard. And I remember when we raised our seed round, it took us like 60 to 70 meetings to raise $1 million in terms of seed funding. And then our Series D, which was a $90 million raise, that took place in 6 weeks because by then the Alexa had come on. And so everyone realized, okay, voice actually is very different than how we think about it. Because I remember when we started Pindrop and I was talking about voice and voice security, everybody was like, oh, you're securing phone calls? Oh, the phone call is going to go away. And I had to keep coming back to people and saying, yeah, the phone call might go away as it exists right now, but we as humans communicate with voice, and that's not going in any place. And that's what we want to secure because there's so many ways in which people can mimic your voice or spoof your voice and spoof your device and things like that. But back then, it was really hard for people to understand why voice would be important. And then you had Alexa, which, completely changed in the way we thought about interfaces between humans and machines. And then with Chat GPT, and if you look at GPT-0 right now and the way you can actually have a conversation with an assistant, it's completely different. And so now it's a whole lot more easier. But back then, everyone thought we were stark raving mad.
So much anymore. So half the world is going to the polls this year. And I believe that deepfake voice calls had a watershed moment. You're the expert, you know better than me, but it became very high profile earlier in the year with the primaries and Biden's voice being spoofed to try to prevent potential voters from going to the polls. That was a wake-up call. It's prevalent, it's easy to do, the attacks are only going to increase, let alone the business side of deepfake detection. But what would you say the impact of that has been on raising awareness about the potential threat?
Oh, it's been really significant because, everybody talked about, the fact that there could be election interference due to deep fakes. And at the beginning of an election year, on January, you had a deep fake. And, you had a deep fake of not anyone, you had a deep fake of the president of the free world. It couldn't get more high profile than that. And what that has allowed, a lot of people to do is understand, all the nuances of deepfakes, right? Like the fact that, we've been doing deepfake research for 8 years. So when we started, there was just one tool. There was a tool called Lyrebird. At the end of last year, there were 120 voice cloning apps. By March of this year, there are 38 voice cloning apps. So that explosion is one. The second, I don't know if you remember, there was a point in time where John Legend became the voice of Google Home. And he had to go into the Google studios, record like 20 odd hours of him speaking so that Google Home could say, when you said, what's the weather in San Francisco? You could hear Aiden John Legend's lilting voice. Oh, it's a balmy, whatever, 26 degrees Celsius, whatever, like the answer. But it took him 20 hours to get Google Home to reproduce that voice. Right now, these voice cloning tools can reproduce your voice with 5 seconds of your voice. And to get a high quality version that can fool your spouse, your kid, you need 15 seconds. So to go from 20 hours to 5 seconds, to go from one tool to 350 tools, just being able to showcase all of that, that's what that Biden robocall allowed folks like us to do. And then to say that you can actually have good AI to beat this bad AI. And what does that mean? That was the third piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so true story. This feels like a therapy session. So last week, my mom calls me, and of course, I'm her IT guy. And she says, I just got a call from Microsoft saying my Office subscription is about to expire and they need my credit card number. And thankfully, my mom's smart enough to have been a little skeptical and said, hey, what should I do? There are a lot of people who may not question that phishing attack or the phishing attempt. And my question for you, maybe this is naive, but I really don't understand. At what point does Pindrop insert itself so that, at the moment of truth, when my innocent mom is about to give up her credit card number, at what point can Pindrop intercept that, detect that it's a deep fake, and do something about it?
Yeah, so technically we're actually there, right? So right now, so if you think about deep fakes, they're breaking trust in commerce, right? Every enterprise in a remote call doesn't know that you're on the other end, and is it really even a human on the other end? And we're seeing those attacks. Just to give you a sense of the attacks, last year we were seeing one attack every single month that used generative AI. This year, in the first 4 months, we're seeing one attack every single day per customer. So there's been a 450% increase in deepfake attacks in commerce in just this year, and the year is just getting started. So deepfakes break trust in commerce. They break trust in media, like we talked about, in the news media and the social media. We talked about the Biden robocall, but there's been instances of Tom Hanks selling dental plan ads and things like that. And then communication, right? Like your grandmom getting a call, that's already happening. The grandparent scam is one of the most nefarious scams because they're using simple TikTok videos of your grandkids, just 3 to 5 seconds. And then they're coming in. And not only are they coming in and targeting your but they're doing it in very specific ways. They're going after very specific counties. They're hitting that county, all the senior citizens of that county from Friday to Sunday. And then on Monday morning, all of them are showing up at the local law enforcement, place saying, I lost $20,000. I lost $200,000 because I thought I was speaking to my grandkid. I thought he was in trouble. I thought I was giving him $3,000 to get him out of trouble. And so that entire thing, I don't know the last time a particular technology has broken trust in commerce, in media, in communication. And so we've started off on the commerce side of things, but we absolutely want to be present when your grandmom is getting a call to say, this is not your grandkid. This is actually a machine on the other end. This is AI generated, but it's going to take a while because getting into the core telephony infrastructure requires participation from the handset manufacturers or the carriers. And as these attacks become more and more prevalent, the consumer is going to demand that. More importantly, the consumer is probably going to go to a carrier or a handset manufacturer that protects them, or you as a son or a grandson are going to say, I'm going to buy you a service where you're protected against this that has these kinds of capabilities. But that takes time. And unfortunately, I wish we could do this faster. I'm super impatient. I'd love to get this technology to all of these places. But the problem is until people get hurt, and this is like this awful truth that we live in, right? Like until the attack actually becomes bad enough, people don't take action.
So not to oversimplify things, but I think the workflow is today that attempt has to be flagged by a consumer or whoever and brought to the attention of your customer, the Pindrop customer. And then the foam printing or the kind of fingerprint for voice technology can assess the likelihood that it's synthetic or that it's a deepfake attempt. Is that the right way to think about the workflow?
No, the workflow is actually for us purely on the enterprise side. So let's say you, Dan, you're calling your bank, your healthcare provider, your retailer. Is it really Dan calling, or is it a deep fake of Dan? And you're trying to access your bank account, you're accessing your healthcare records. That's the only place we play right now. But there's an entire world, like you said. So we are protecting your account from getting taken over, your account from reconnaissance. But there's an entire world of identity theft, which is what you're talking about, where grandparents, either the money is getting stolen or the information is getting stolen. That's a space we're not in. And that space requires carriers or handset manufacturers to start playing in that space. And if you remember, there used to be these caller ID services that used to tell you, we're going to assure you that we're going to tell you who is calling you on the other end. So you need a more enhanced version of that actually says this is a deep fake or not.
So Pindrop is preventing your customer from getting phished.
Yes.
And because your customer owns that voice, that audio file already. It makes perfect sense. On this podcast, we talk a lot about what it means to exercise AI responsibly. And I'm just going to go on a little thought experiment here. Pindrop is in the middle of making an important decision, whether or not that, let's say, consumer, the banking customer, whoever, is who that person claims to be. And it's an automated decision. It's using AI, hopefully, because it's Pindrop and you're brilliant. Most of the time, it'll get it right. But there's the potential for both a false positive, saying that someone is a bad actor when they're not. They're a good actor. And of course, the threat of a false negative where they're a bad actor and you don't detect it. How do you coach your team about how to mitigate the impact of both false positives and false negatives?
So we already do this. So right now we analyze 5 billion voice calls, and you can imagine we have, false positives and false negatives. And the way it actually works is we actually, alert on calls that are risky. And, hey, call center agent, this call has a high risk score. So here's a red. So do this particular, workflow, as opposed to a green call where you can give them keys to the kingdom. Now, we obviously sometimes, very rarely, right? Like we work at, because we have customers who have hundreds of millions of calls, false positives are really important. So we operate at a 0.1% false positive rate. So really low false positives. So we have to operate at that level. And similarly on the false negative rate, we measure it by what's known as the equal error rate. But we have to do that at really low percentages. But that still means when you have, billions of calls, you're going to have a false positive or a false negative. And the way it actually works is if we miss a bad person getting in, that particular customer's account has gotten compromised and they've lost money. Immediately, there's a fraud team who gets every single alert that Pindrop generated as a case. So what they do is they go create a manual case saying, you missed this particular fraud call. And that becomes a reinforcement learning mechanism for our machine learning systems. Oh, what were the factors and why did they score lesser? And the system automatically starts changing the weights because, it realizes something is changing. But if it isn't able to figure it out, then we have an army of researchers. 1 in 5 employees at Pindrop has a PhD in signal processing or machine learning. And so they go in and say, oh my God, what is happening? And we actually have built brand new products based on these false positives, false negatives, just as an aside. And so what's happened is we will then go look at that call and realize where did we miss out. And the same thing is when we actually inconvenience a customer, the analyst comes back and says, no, we actually called the customer, we checked everything. It was them doing that transaction. And for whatever reason, you called it fraudulent. And then we go, if we're doing this too often, we're going and checking the systems, but otherwise the system automatically realizes, oh, you know what? We were calling this bad because they traditionally seem to be calling from a particular location. Now they're moving all over the place. And they just happen to become a consultant in their job, let's say. And so we have to learn that's their new pattern and that's their new baseline. And so we're constantly learning. The system is automatically learning on its own, but where it doesn't, we have people coming in. And there are situations where when people have come in, they've said, oh, there's a brand new product to be created. That also happens at Pindrop. Does that help?
It's a very satisfying answer.
Yeah.
I assumed you'd have a really good answer for it, and that's what I'd expect. Very rigorous
Yeah, the
approach.
best amazing thing is we have armies. We have 8 of the top 10 banks, 5 of the top 7 insurances, some of the biggest healthcare retailers. Each of them has a fraud analyst team who's giving us this feedback. And that's amazing because what that's allowed us to do is also build the world's largest database of these bad actors. So if you actually come to Pindrop, every conference room is named after a bad guy that we've caught. So you have Pepe and Chicken Man and Dava and all of these different names based on this wonderful input that we're getting from these fraud analysts.
You're going to need a bigger building soon.
Every time a conference room comes up, there's like hundreds of names that we have to pick up from. And yeah, it's super interesting times.
So a related and equally important topic within this kind of domain of responsible AI, your models are training on a massive amount of data that contains a lot of PII or personally identifiable information. You cited, the banks and the insurance companies. Almost by definition, you're intercepting information that's incredibly sensitive. And if your models are trained on my social security number and my kids' birthdays and that sort of thing, you have to be able to ensure me that either you're notifying me as the consumer about what you're collecting and what you're doing with the data. I need to know that that wasn't used in nefarious ways to train models. And I also want assurance, I think, me as your customer or me as your future customer, that you take the security of the data that you're using to train the models from one customer, let's say my competitor, with utmost care, so that doesn't adversely, leak competitive information that I own to my competitor. How do you think of that?
Yeah, it's a super important question. So the way to think about it is we actually have 2 products. One that looks for risk. And that product really doesn't care about you as an individual. All it's looking for is risk signals. This call is coming from a phone number that's in the US, but I'm seeing all the audio characteristics telling me it's a Skype phone calling from Nigeria. I don't need to know it's Dan. I just know that this is a domestic call. Why is it coming from a Skype phone from Nigeria? Or I'm seeing the same device print on 40 different calls, accessing 40 different accounts, and they all are this fraudulent call center in Eastern Europe, right? And so in each of those situations, I really don't need to know anything about you. And so in that risk situation, we're looking at aggregate statistics to be able to determine when a particular instance is risky or not. Then there is the other part where we're trying to say this is really Dan. And we're doing that in 3 ways. We're actually saying this is Dan based on his voice, based on his device, and based on his behavior. And there you're absolutely right. Like we actually ask you, we're like, every time a customer calls in, they're like saying, oh, you know what? I want to check my account balance. And they're like, okay, answer these 9 questions, or answer these 7, answer these 5. And the call center agent is, do you want to go through all of these questions, or do you want multi-factor authentication enabled on your account by which we can automatically determine your voice, device, and behavior and then allow you to seamlessly authenticate thereafter? And again, a lot of this, if you think about it, even the voice features which are closest to you, there's no way to reverse engineer the voice features to say it's Dan's voice. What we're doing is, this is account number 123456. It has these voice features and we have a hash of it. We don't even have the exact account number. So we don't even know whose account it is, that it is actually Dan's. And these voice features are a representation of your vocal anatomy, some set of measurements about your vocal anatomy. So they are on their own. We've theoretically proven that those features can't be used to determine that it's Dan's voice. So they just think about it as a cryptographic key of your voice that's just saying it's account hexadecimal 12346's voice. And that's all we know. Everything, all the keys to the kingdom are with the bank, with the healthcare organization. And we don't share any of this, right? Like the voice, the device, and behavior are restricted to the tenant of that particular organization. So there is no sharing. And in fact, because we don't know it's Dan's voice, we can't identify Dan's voice at another customer based on seeing you already at a particular place. We do that for fraudsters, the bad side of things, because if a fraudster attacks a particular bank and a healthcare, we want to use that. We don't do that for the positive side of things. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So what I would call, you're storing the metadata, but not the data, because the
Not the
model's
data
not
at all.
going to, there's no benefit to that. So regulation aside, what do you think about the ethical obligation that you have to make let's say the consumer in this case, just for simple terms, aware of the fact that there's phone printing going on, with regard to that conversation?
Oh, so we actually tell them, right? Like we ask them for consent, and it's when they say, "Oh, you know what? Yeah, I don't want to answer all these questions, and if you're going to make sure that post this, I am getting authenticated faster because on average we're able to shave 44 seconds of the consumer's time answering a set of questions or looking at an OTP, and just their metadata being able to prove who they are." And then like I call in, I say, "Hey, I want to check my account balance." And they're like, "Okay, we verified your voice device behavior because in the previous call you gave us consent to do that. And then how can I help you today?" So it's that change, but you're absolutely right. Like that portion is something that letting the customer know, do they want this better method? And a lot of our customers also have websites telling people, okay, this is what it actually means. So if you want to get more information, here's a link for you to go see what this actually means. And it's funny, before COVID, we used to have a take rate of about 60%. That is, 60% of customers would say, "Yeah, I want that thing faster." After COVID, it jumped to 78% because people were like, "Man, I'm just checking some basic stuff and you're still asking me all these questions." And most of these questions, answers are already there. Like, I'd much rather a more secure method.
So maybe this is a silly question, but won't the deepfake generation tools quickly learn to opt out of being phone printed?
Yeah, they could opt out of being phone printed. And this is where, right, that's where the risk signals come in, right? Even if you opt out of phone printing, you can use the risk signals to then determine, hey, this is still weird. This is a deep fake. And it's the deep fake that's trying to opt out of the phone print. That's why those two things are two completely separate units within Pindrop. They're actually two sides of the coin. One is a super optimistic version of the world, right? Oh, the only people who are calling me are good people. So I'm going to create, with their consent, their voices, devices, and behavior, and use that to identify them purely on the idea that the customer experience and the handle time is going to be better. And then there's the super paranoid side of Pindrop, which is like everything is bad. Everybody who's out there is trying to get into an account, and that doesn't need to know you. It's just focusing on trying to determine risky signals.
It makes sense. The topic of ethics makes me wonder, is that, I assume the FINRA, et cetera, aren't yet regulating this. So is it Pindrop recommending or requiring your customer to enforce that notification? Or is it your customer opting in to wanting that notification?
Yeah, it's I mean, like we obviously say, "Hey, this is the way you do it," and because we've learned over best practices. But our customers are often making that determination, and when they're looking for fraud signals, they're like saying, "Oh, this is purely a fraud tool. I don't want to let the fraudster know this is what we're doing. So we're going to do this completely passively." And so they're making the determination that, "Oh, you know what? For me, I am better suited to protect my customers' accounts, and giving a lot of information is a bad idea. And I'm tipping off the fraudster onto exactly what we're doing. So we're going to do it purely as a fraud benefit. And therefore, I'm not going to, say all of this, right? Give this entire preamble." And then there are customers who are like, "This is purely customer experience." So letting the customer know this is the right way is their prerogative. So it's completely based on the individual organization, and they're making the determination on whether it's a fraud fighting capability or it is a customer experience capability, and they're determining it based on that.
I'm sure in a decade this will all be legislated and there'll be strict regulations, but I say frequently on this podcast, it's up to the AI community to act ethically. And so I'm glad that you've let out, in terms of kind of proactive self-regulation. So We've been talking to Vijay, the CEO and the technologist, but I'm curious to ask Vijay the human a question. And that is, we've been talking a lot about why consumers like my mom should be on heightened alert and maybe even a little scared, but at least aware of what's ahead. And so my wonderful, innocent mom all of a sudden learns to not trust the media, not trust her bank, not trust Microsoft, etc. And it violates this kind of social contract. Just as humans, we like to think that people have good intentions. What does it mean for just how humans interact with each other if all of a sudden we have to ask, is it a human I'm talking to? Should I trust that person? And do we shift to a post-truth world where we first assume bad intentions as opposed to first assuming good intentions?
Yeah. So I think this cycle as old as humanity, right? Like when the internet came out, it's all sunshine and roses, and then people were like, "Oh my God, my information is getting stolen on the internet. I can't use a credit card online because as soon as I use it online, it's not encrypted. Like I've given my information and now I found my information available in some dark web somewhere." And so the internet is bad. And then there were all of these internet security companies that came and made it secure. And then you started trusting the internet more because there were cryptographic ways in which you exchanged information and so on. It's even before that when laptops came in initially, people are like, "Oh, this is beautiful, I have a laptop." And then viruses started coming on and people are like, don't go to the website, don't do this, don't do that. And now you don't have all of that fear mongering anymore because you have incredible antivirus companies, you have incredible solutions that protect your laptop and look out for you. I think it's the same cycle with generative AI, right? Like generative AI is this brand new shiny thing, promises employee productivity, new revenue streams, customer experience, better customer experience. So it's shiny and it's going to create lots of new areas of growth. But with it comes all of these perils, the biggest of which is deepfakes, which is breaking trust in commerce, in media, in communication. And you need a class of security companies with technology like liveness and these things to bring back trust to these things. And we're going to go through that cycle. We're going to go through a trough of disillusionment where we're all going to say everything is lost. And then they're going to be like, "Oh, but people who have this kind of technology don't seem to get fished, don't seem to be as worked up on answering the phone call. Oh, maybe I should go adopt that." And it doesn't have to be Pindrop. It'll be like a class of companies that do this. They're going to be winners in that space. We hope Pindrop's a winner in that space. But then people are going to restore trust back to this new world. And that's just, that's even in media, right? Like when the original media, or even now, you're like, okay, can I trust the news? And there's all of this notion of fake news, right? You'll come to an answer where you get the sources that you get, and you'll start to trust it once again.
I like that even as a security expert, you can remain optimistic. That's encouraging. It's
the only way, man.
You bet. Hey, Vijay, I know this one sped by. We're about out of time, but I'm not letting you off the hot seat without answering one last important question for me. So let's say we're back here in a decade and we're having a version of this conversation. Defeated the deepfakes? Have the bots become smarter? Are we seeing bots competing with bots? What does the world look like? Where is this technology going?
Yeah, I think where we would like to see it is absolutely we've figured out ways to detect these deepfakes, and there's a fundamental challenge, right? As these deepfake engines, we have only one primary objective: we have to detect the deepfake. The deepfake system has two, right? It has to sound intelligible to a human speech and it has to evade detection. And as we've run these cycles, we've seen the more you try to evade detection, you're trying to do these unnatural things, which makes your speech less intelligible, which means the human is itself detecting something's off with this entire system. So our hope is, fast forward, we're able to routinely detect deepfakes very comfortably, and deepfakes that are trying to avoid things are not as intelligible or require crazy amounts of compute and storage that it's really hard, that there is a new security threat thereafter. And Pindrop is hopefully playing in that space as well. But that's the nature. I mean, it's a cat and mouse game until it's not, and find an easier way to do things. Our hope is we've raised the bar high enough that the average fraudster doesn't find their way in, and we're protecting consumers, enterprises, and media from disinformation, from commerce, and from just basic communication.
I'm going to extend an open offer as the world evolves and as Pindrop evolves, and we as consumers evolve in our sophistication of detecting this stuff. I'd love to have you back and unpack some of these conversations in more detail, if that would be okay.
No, I'd love that, Dan. This was an incredible conversation.
I really enjoyed this. Vijay, before I can let you go, how can our listeners learn more about you and the great work that your team's doing?
Yeah, so it's very easy. Just go onto our website, which is www.pindrop.com. If you want to hear what we do about deepfakes, just do a /deepfake. And if anybody wants to reach out to me with a deepfake issue, it's just vijay@pindrop.com.
Brilliant. Thanks for hanging out. This has been so much fun.
Thank you.
Excellent. And again, thanks to Yvette from JC2 for all that great prep for this conversation. That is a wrap for this week on AI and the Future of Work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from PeopleRain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.